gestur okkar í dag Laura Watts. Professor Laura Watts has been professor at Sonoma State University, came to us as a Fulbright researcher and decided to stay. Her research project for some time has been a remote region in the Westfjords, in the northeastern part of the Westfjords, if we can say so, the Strand region, which is very sparsely populated. Laura's research topic before, or let's say during her time at Sonoma State University, has been umhverfissaga, environmental history and policy, umhverfissaga og stefnumótun umhverfismála. She has been at the Department of Geography, Planning and the Environment, and has been coordinator of a master's program in, now you need to help me.
Cultural Resources Management.
Cultural Resources Management. We have so many resources management, so I mixed them up all. But as you can hear, this is relatively close to the master's program in regional development and coastal communities here at the University Center. Og Laura mun tala í dag Árneshrepp og umhverfissögu Árneshrepps og eins og hún kallar það á ensku Wild But Home, og ég held titillinn segir ansi mikið, Wild But Home. There more or less everything is said. Takk Laura. Thank you for being here with us in Iceland Háskólaseturs today, and gjörðu svo vel.
Thank you so much. So thank you for that introduction, Peter. Yes, I'm a professor. I've been a professor at Sonoma State in Northern California, about an hour north of San Francisco, for the last 15 years, but now have somewhat impetuously taken early retirement, and I'm staying here in Iceland. I've started a consulting company, Aspara Consulting, which so far is employing me to do talks like this. But hopefully we'll do some more environmental history research sometime soon. And what brought me here to Iceland last year was a Fulbright grant, as Peter mentioned, hosted here at the University Center to investigate a history of land uses in the Westfjords in this specific region. So let me see if this works. Okay, so I'm an environmental historian, and people often ask, what is that? Environmental historians are people who are interested in relationships between people and their environments through time, writ large. So that can encompass an awful lot of things. And I always use this quote from my friend and colleague, Nancy Langston, from her wonderful book on the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Eastern Oregon, just stating any ecosystem is, of course, the product of its history, and that includes cultural as well as ecological forces. So trying to think about cultural aspects of the world and natural aspects together, rather than seeing them as oppositional or in different sort of fields of study. I specifically take a landscape approach to thinking about my work. Landscapes have been defined as the interaction of people and place, thinking about how places shape the people who live and work in them, and then conversely, the people who live and work in them shape the places. And so over time, they're in this relationship with each other. Geographer Donald Meinig has said that landscapes are amalgams, not only what lies before our eyes, but what also is within our heads, the ideas, the values, the cultural understandings of places that we bring to them affects how we experience them, how we use them, and in turn, how they get shaped. Geographer Pierce Lewis, yes, he does spell his name wrong. That is correct. He's described landscapes as our unwitting autobiographies. Over time, people are writing their own stories into the landscape without intending to, but the marks that they leave, the ways in which the land is shaped or not shaped by their activities, leaves a story that we can read if we know how to read the clues. When I'm teaching landscape theory to my students, I often describe it as if we're fish swimming around in the water and we have a hard time seeing the water. So that's really what training in landscape history is aimed at, is teaching us to see the water that we're surrounded by all the time. I would argue that all landscapes are always both natural and cultural. They're not separate entities. The busiest sidewalk in Manhattan has natural elements to it, and the most remote wild part of the Arctic has cultural elements as well. And because landscapes are affected both by ecological forces and by cultural forces, they are necessarily dynamic. They're always changing. There's no such thing as holding one still in perpetuity. And I study a lot of national parks and other kinds of efforts to protect landscapes, which are often talked about as if we're going to keep it the same forever. And that, of course, can't happen. Landscapes are always changing in some way, which makes them interesting to study. It's also a very interdisciplinary way of thinking about research. So I'm not only looking at historical documents, but I look at maps, at ecological histories, at archaeological work. I'm interested in reading folklore and the stories people tell about places. So it's really a very magpie's way of doing research, of picking up all the information that you possibly can. I guess it would be ravens here, not magpies, and putting it together. And I just want to say outset today, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm a newcomer to this area. When I first arrived here last year, I didn't intend to stay. I ended up through luck and perseverance and help from the University Center, sticking around. But I run the risk of telling people here or on the Zoom about history that they actually know better than I do. I'm very much a newcomer to this area, but I'm hoping that by looking at some known information through a different lens, there might shed some new light on it. So that's my hope today. So this is the region that I'm studying, the Árneshreppur region. I always am so happy when I see that sign driving in. I'm probably even pronouncing it wrong, but Árneshreppur is Iceland's smallest municipality. It's hampered by a lack of year-round access and also poor electrical connectivity in terms of being a really vibrant community. I use this map because it shows what are described as the major roads around the country. And whoops, hey, come back, there we go. I thought it was interesting that there aren't any. There's absolutely none shown on this map to the region in the black circle, which is the area that I'm studying, the Strandir. There is some concern that this community will vanish completely as a standalone community. Currently, the official population is about 40 people. In winter, that's even fewer. And because the area can often get cut off for weeks with if there's an avalanche across the road or something along those lines. The road is, even when it's open, is a bit hair-raising to drive. Always, this corner in particular is not my favorite. One of the things that I've found interesting in studying this area is that the road in to this whole region was only completed in 1967. So the road is actually a very new part of this landscape. Prior to that, the region was only accessed via boats and the ocean. And so there's sort of an irony that now that it's connected to the road system, however tenuously, it's actually become more remote than it was in the past. It was far more connected through fishing boats and trade and other kinds of things like that, which I'll talk about here. And part of why I got interested in studying this, or at least part of why it suddenly had some urgency when I was writing my Fulbright proposal, is this proposed hydropower plant called I can never say it right. I always drop the R. So it's shown here on the map as the dotted red line. This is a proposal that was made a number of years ago to be built on the northern edge of the Árneshreppur municipality. It's just south of the Hornstrandir National Reserve, which was set aside in 1975 as specifically a roadless reserve. It's accessible only by boat or by foot. And this proposal, to say the least, has become something of a flashpoint of controversy in recent years around the entire country. Part of why it is seen as necessary by some is because the area is not well served electrically. As you can kind of see on this map, all of the electricity to this region comes in on a single line. In fact, all of the electricity for all of the Westfjords comes in on a single line from the rest of the country, but at least the other lines are larger. They're more high-powered lines. The ones in Árneshreppur, this is literally the line it comes in on. So when there's a winter storm, you can imagine these lines can get knocked down or cut off fairly easily. So it is a fragile system especially in the wintertime. And from this schematic of high voltage lines around the country, I think you can see both how remote the Strandir is energy-wise compared to other communities in the country. And so this proposal represented, to some people at least, a chance for renewal, perhaps. It would not only have brought more reliable energy sources, but also improved infrastructure. The road would need to be improved one way or another for the plant to be built and so forth. But of course, it's also been seen as a threat to the area's remote and natural character by others. And so you saw a lot of these kinds of headlines. This is from the summer of 2019. The area characterized as untouched and pristine, and arguing instead that perhaps the natural reserve of the Hornstrandir should be extended further south to include the potential dam sites and protect this area as a wild nature. The area, of course, does have a long and significant human history. This region of Iceland was settled around the same time as the rest of the country in the 9th century. And in fact, one of the things I've been finding as I've been reading more and more, especially archaeological research about this area, is how all the Westfjords have a history that's actually somewhat distinct from the rest of Iceland. And so there's something that I'm sort of playing around with that in my head. The hydropower proposal is currently, as far as I know, still on hold. It's just kind of not definitely happening, not been abandoned. There are, of course, regardless of whether it's built or not, there are serious questions about the longevity of this community without the infrastructure improvements that either the hydropower plant would bring, or if the region was formally designated as wilderness or as a park, what kinds of infrastructure would be needed for that as well. So there's, I think, a lot of interesting questions. I am not here to answer those questions. I do not know what the right answer is. I'm not a policy, I'm not recommending policy to a country that I've just set foot in, about 5 minutes ago, it seems. And my research isn't actually addressing the question about hydropower versus wilderness. I'm not an energy expert. That's not my field. So what I'm doing instead is just working to document the human history of this region a little better. And as a backdrop and a way of better understanding any discussions of the region's future. I think, while it's unquestionably a wild and mostly unpopulated place, it's definitely not untouched. And so understanding the human backdrop, the human history of even the wildest places, I think is an important part of that conversation. Why am I interested in participating in that conversation? Because I've been studying similar kinds of issues in California, where I'm originally from, for the last 20 years. This book of mine came out in 2017, The Paradox of Preservation, Wilderness and Working Landscapes of Point Reyes National Seashore, which is in Northern California, very close to where I used to live. And this was involved similar tensions between local residents' livelihoods, in this case, cattle ranching, and a modern day idealization as wilderness as empty and peopleless places. And there's been a lot of political strife and back and forthing going on about this particular national seashore. And I think that environmental history has a power to illuminate, not eliminate, pardon me. I can't even speak English. To illuminate these relationships, especially even those sort of human histories that have been intentionally erased in the name of wilderness preservation. So I'd written a lot about these dynamics of Point Reyes, and I'm not sure I ever would have seen the similarities, even though both of these are coastal environments with long agricultural and maricultural histories. But I happened to be visiting Djúpavik in the Strandir back in both 2017, 2018 for photography trips. And after staying there twice, getting to know the proprietors here a bit, this is Aussie and Eva, I sent them a copy of my book as a thank you. This was literally not thinking that they were necessarily going to read it. They do have a shelf in their hotel of books in English. And so I was thinking this book would go on the shelf and they would never touch it. And maybe some of the visitors would look at it, but it was really just to say, thank you for your hospitality. But then a few months later, Ava wrote to me and she said, I'm reading your book and I'm seeing so many parallels between what you were writing about in California and some of the discussions that are going on here. So that's what gave me this idea that perhaps I could come and do a research project here. And just in this last week, we've all seen this news that the Lonely Planet folks have named the Westfjords the best place to travel next year. So I think even with the hydropower debate on hold or wherever it is at this point, I think changes are happening. This designation may or may not be a mixed blessing. I think I've heard all different responses to it. The Westfjords are a place that have limited infrastructure for large numbers of tourists. So there's going to be some changes coming, especially with this kind of attention. I know there's been some debates about creating a new national park, perhaps at Dinjandi, maybe more than one. That would attract even more visitors. And at the same time, I was reading an op-ed this summer that pointed out, had some data, electrical use has increased in the Westfjords 8.5 times between 1974 and 2020, largely due to the shifting from heating with fuel oil to electricity. And then layered on that, there's the nation's overall goal as part of combating climate change to ban the sale of regular petrol and diesel cars by 2030. That's only 8 years away. So the number of electrical vehicles is going to be going up as well, both for residents living here and for visitors coming in their rental cars. So there's going to need to be ways of accommodating that increased demand for electricity. Again, it's not my job to say how that's done at all. But I do think that assembling and documenting the human history of this wild place will be an important element of that conversation that's going on. So I probably have too much local history to talk about. I'm going to try to keep myself rolling along here. This is a local map of the region showing every building just about, I think, in the entire region. Djupavik, which I'll be talking about a lot, is here, and then more settlements across. So this is it is a sparsely populated landscape, but it has been shaped over time by the people living there, like I said, by both ecological forces and by cultural forces. And so we can look at this landscape and say, and ask, what's the autobiography that we read, the unwitting autobiography from this place? I found it interesting, again, learning about this place as a newcomer, that the Westfjords in general, older geologically, also colder and drier than most of the rest of coastal Iceland, due to the larger influence of the East Greenland current and also the proximity to Greenland itself. The glacier that is, I wonder, can I go backwards? There is a glacier that's just barely visible at the top of this map, Drangajökull. It is lower in elevation than any of the other large glaciers in the country, which are all in the southeast. So it gives a sense of the effect of this different climate, this cooler and drier climate, that glaciers can actually still exist in this area where they can't elsewhere. The region was historically more affected by sea ice than some other parts of the country. And these factors have combined to make agriculture less successful and fishing, often for export, more erratic. There would be years with bad sea ice that could cut off fishing for long periods of time, or years when fishing was great. So I think one of the things that I find interesting is the ways in which people living in this region had to be able to swing opportunistically or adaptively, given each year's climatic shifts. If the fishing isn't good this year, you're going to need to go hunt seals or collect seaweed or hope for whale stranding, or there's going to be a number of different kinds of resources that people were relying upon to manage to survive in this harsh landscape. Archaeologist Ragnar Edvardsson has, from his archaeological work, estimated that even in medieval times, fishing represented up to 50 to 60% farms value in this region, in all the Westfjords. Agriculture was only about 20% of a farm's value. So the income or the overall value that people were getting from the on-land landscape is much smaller than from the merescape, from the ocean. So fishing would be both close shore fishing mostly for domestic use, farther offshore fishing, mainly cod, for trade or export as dried fish. And one of the interesting things, this is Gjögur, which is on the opposite shore of the fjord that Djupavik is on. One of the fun things about wandering around with your camera is sometimes you take pictures of things that you think are just strange local quirks. And then you realize later that they actually have cultural significance, part of that autobiography. So I think this was in 2018, I took this photograph of a house in Gjögur that has a weather vane shaped like a shark. And I thought, somebody has a funny sense of humor. And of course, I learned later that Gjögur was a major shark oil fishery. Again, a big export product for this region. One of the other large resources that I had not thought of as a natural resource until coming here is driftwood. Primarily trees coming from Siberia, floating along on the Arctic currents and landing here. They wash up on particular beaches. If the beach is too rocky or too cliffy, they can't accumulate. If the beach isn't situated the right direction, they'll just get washed away or they won't arrive to begin with. So here's a major resource in a country that famously does not have a lot of trees. It's a source of wood, and anytime, even today, driving along this coast, you see these piles of driftwood that have been piled up to dry out. They're used for building boats, sometimes burning for fuel, building houses, all kinds of things. This region was also known for its expertise in carving. This is a wooden boat. I don't know if it was made from driftwood or not, but it happened to be on the shore at Gjögur. But the region was known for carving things, making things out of driftwood, things like kitchen implements, other kinds of necessities. Often using the shark skin to polish the wood carvings, which I thought was brilliant. In Ragnar's estimation, driftwood represents between 15 and 20% of farms' values for the farms that happen to receive driftwood. So about equal to what agriculture was providing for this region in terms of overall value. And there were complex rules in terms of who had rights to which driftwood, who had to share what with the community, et cetera. Not going to go into all that, but there's a lot of really interesting history in terms of how people are organizing and utilizing these natural resources that come, again, somewhat opportunistically. Sometimes it arrives and sometimes it doesn't. With so little wood in the area, of course, people were living mostly in sod houses, common for centuries. This is just a little shed on one of the farms that's still there, built in this style. Houses would have been heated with peat rather than wood, primarily because wood was such a precious resource. So having a source of peat on your farmscape is, again, an important landscape element that people relied on. If your farm didn't have a place to dig peat, you're going to be needing to get fuel from somewhere else. There's a lot of these sort of remnants of old structures in the landscape that I found from at least many of the people that I know coming from the US, primarily as photographers interested in taking pictures of this beautiful natural landscape. It's like their eye just isn't trained to see those remains. And they see that there's a stone wall, but they're not really thinking about what those walls represent, how long those structures may have been there, or what it tells them about how people lived in this place. So I think there's an untapped potential there for telling more cultural history in this region. Often what we hear about the Westfjords is that it's empty, right? That there's nobody there. Of course, you're staying in a hotel, so there must be somebody there. But this sort of marketing campaign of the Westfjords as empty nature, I think there could be a countercurrent to that of saying there's a lot of remnants of a very old human habitation here as well, that shows us how people and the natural world can live together, if not in harmony, at least somewhat cohesively. I've gotten really interested. I'm always interested in the marks that people leave on the land. And so I'm just fascinated. This is a view from the top of the waterfall at Djupavik looking down. And of course, there's these drainage canals, any place where people are developing sheep pastures. And I'm not actually sure. I don't think anyone's actively grazing this pasture anymore. It's just behind where the hotel is. But the marks are still there. And so again, this is part of that autobiography of people's use of this landscape, leaving marks that we can read if we know how to read them. And I'm not sure how people who aren't thinking about landscape history see those lines, whether they notice them or not. Or if they do, maybe it's just, it's not important. Driving around the landscape, there's all these hints of the place's story as well. One of the things I love about Iceland is everything has names. This is a sign for an abandoned farm. So the name is still part of the landscape. People drive by and can see it. You can tell it's an abandoned farm because there's a little house on the sign with an X through it. But keeping the stories of these places alive simply with signage is really an interesting aspect of recognizing the long history of this place. Even rocks. This is my favorite rock. Even rocks have names. I noticed as a photographer, passing by this rock, it has this funny tuft of vegetation on the top that looked like a sculpture. And so I was like, oh, we have to stop and take a picture of it. And after I posted the picture online, someone said, oh, that rock name is Skirkotlustein. I think I'm saying that somewhat right. So, the rock has a presence, has a personality. The road was actually angled slightly when it was built to go around this rock to not disturb him. He's, from the archaeological reports, has a long history of association with magic. This, the landscape has a real blue history. There we go. that I think is really interesting. And of course, I got most drawn to the history at Djupavik. It's odd that Árneshreppur was being such a remote and unpopulated place. It's also the location of one of the first big investments in modern industrialization in Iceland. Part of the herring adventure that built processing plants across northern Iceland. But this was, at the time it was built, the largest and certainly the most sort of cutting edge in terms of the technology that they were using. Only the best materials to build this herring factory. This is what it looked like back when it was operational. This massive herring processing plant was built by hand with materials brought in by ship in 1934 and 35. It started operation in July of 35. At the time, it was the largest all concrete building in Iceland and one of the largest in Europe. It's really just a simply enormous structure. Financing came from shipping companies in Reykjavik and also from investors in Sweden. And so when this was in operation, ships would bring their catch of herring to the wharf. Fish would be sorted out. The best ones would be processed by women out on the pier there, salted and put in barrels. These were to be processed to be eaten. Poor quality fish and the heads from these fish would all go into the factory, carried by a giant conveyor belt where they would be pressed to extract the oil. And then whatever was remained sort of cooked and cut and made into fish meal, which can be used for either animal feed or fertilizer. The oil in turn was stored in these huge concrete tanks. I was just re-listening to a recording of the factory tour that you can go on today. And Magnus was saying, the oil is where the money was. This is really what they're building this thing for. It's not the fish to eat. It's not the fish meal. Certainly it's the oil. So it'd be stored in these huge tanks and then shipped out for various industrial uses, including wartime building of armaments for cooling steel when it's been manufactured and so forth. The tanks are still there. They're fascinating, especially if you like to sing. Acoustically, just an amazing space. The coils on the floor were heating coils to heat up the oil to become liquid so that it could be pumped into the ships. And with this, like I said, with this perfectly round shape, they're just fascinating spaces that somewhat famously Sigur Rós came and did a video there after they played one of their shows in the factory. I just find it impressive that they dragged all of their instruments and everything in, because this hole is the only way in and out of this tank. So it's a little bit of a commitment, at least, to working in this space. So the factory was located in part here because it was close to where the herring were at this particular time. Also because the bay is unusually deep. Djupavik, of course, translates to deep bay. Boats could get in very close to shore. This also led to a novel approach for housing the workers. If you look in this photo next to the huge tanks, there is an old ferry that's been beached on the shore, and that was the housing for the men who worked in the factory. Apparently, if something of a pecking order in the culture of folks working there, if you were liked, you got to sleep near the top of the ship, and if you weren't so liked, you slept in the bottom. The ship, this is what it looked like when it was beached, with its ladder for people to get on board to go to sleep. And it's still there today, of course, rusting away. Every year it gets smaller, but is still quite photogenic. And then the women who worked at the factory lived in this building, which has been made into the Hotel Djupavik. The rooms that people now have 1 or 2 people in would have had 8 women per room in bunk beds. And one of the interesting things that I've learned from hearing some of the stories, I'm really interested in learning more about where people came from. Certainly, I was just, again, listening to the descriptions this week, that some of the first people to arrive to build the piers, to rebuild piers that had been built earlier in the 1930s were from Flattery, from just down the road here. So I'm intrigued as to how young people heard about this and came to work for wages, perhaps in some cases for the first time in their lives. Creating a community in this place where there hadn't been one before. Djupavik was not a historic farm. It was sort of made out of whole cloth in that sense. And one of the other interesting things, again, reported from the folks that run Hotel Djupavik, they often have old timers come back to visit these days, people who are still alive, who worked in the factory while it was running between 1935 and 1954. It was only operational for 19 years. And they often talk about, it's very hard work. They, operating all the time. The women were in particular not paid as well as the men. They were paid by the barrel of fish, not by hours worked. So different kind of experience. But almost universally, they also describe those years as the best years of their lives. It was an exciting time for them. They were young and they were making money, and they felt like they were on the edge of some new change in society that was exciting. So I find I'm interested in reading more of those stories and trying to put together what being in this place at this transformational moment of shifting from what had been fairly small scale trading and fishing economy to this suddenly industrialized existence, kind of overnight, what that was like. The factory was so profitable. This is such an amazing photograph of all these barrels and barrels and barrels. The factory was so profitable that the loans were paid off in less than 2 years. They've compared this to if you built Harpa today and paid that off in only 2 years. It was an astonishingly huge investment of money and was paid off very, very quickly. And this operation had far-reaching economic effects for the whole region. Residents, like I said, now have cash jobs, perhaps. Local farmers could sell their produce. There's, all kinds of sort of ripple effects that come with this. And then when the herring, as they always say, the herring left. I don't know, I'm not enough of a fisheries biologist to know how much of that was the herring migrating away versus perhaps being overfished a bit, but they did leave. And so the factory was closed in 1954. I think initially there was some hope that they could restart if the fish came back, but they did not. And so the factory was abandoned, almost left almost all the machinery just left in place, and was finally sold off in 1971. So this area, it is an interesting sort of time capsule of this moment. Again, the road was only completed in 1967. So the remnants of this time, there's just an incredible array of remains left from this area. And then, of course, these two crazy people came along, Eva and Aussie, in the 1980s. I think Aussie originally thought that he could create a fish farming operation using some of the material from the factory. That did not work out very quickly, but they quickly did not work out. But they had acquired the factory and some of the associated buildings. They moved their small young family here and started to refurbish the place and adapt it into a hotel and now a museum as well. It really is an incredible labor of love. They talk about even when they're having good years for the hotel, all of the money just pours right back into the factory. And so, this Djupavik is one of several other industrial remnants of the sort of the herring adventure around the Iceland's northwest coast. I don't think they fit very easily into the common understanding of Iceland's history, which usually focuses on the sagas and the Viking era, a much earlier time. But in a lot of ways, these are very representative of the rapid development and then deindustrialization that affected much of the country through the 20th century. So there's a very interesting, sort of, like I said, time capsule of Icelandic history here that can be informative in a lot of different ways. There are still some sheep farmers in the region that are working year round. This is Litla Avik. And the sheep, of course, have their own profound effects on the landscape with grazing. I always love that some of them are absolutely terrified of us driving by and others are just like totally nonchalant. I think if the region does lose its year-round residents completely, it will lose sheep along with them. And so thinking about, again, the ripple effects of that landscape change in terms of what the place looks like and how it operates is another aspect that needs, I think, to be thought about. And so to wrap this up, I think the transition in the 1930s from this sort of small scale subsistence or trading livelihood to this sort of cutting edge industrial operation could have some lessons for the whole region now as well, at a time when the Westfjords are potentially facing a similar kind of transition. It's not clear, the population has been decreasing in the Westfjords for decades. Between the lessons of the last year and a half or 2 years of COVID, people learning that we can have Zoom meetings and we can work remotely. Will that mean a resurgence of people wanting to live in the Westfjords? That's sort of an open question, I think. There's certainly going to be, at least if the Lonely Planet is an indicator, there's likely to be increased tourism post-COVID, and just decisions about sort of how and where to develop, how and where to protect the landscape, how those things should be done in concert, and what sort of, I think, hopefully a combination of those things going forward. So, I just want to end with thinking about how to think about the natural and cultural history, again, cohesively, rather than oppositionally, and hopefully some of this history will help contribute to that. So thank you so much to Fulbright for bringing me here in the first place, and to the University Center for hosting me here. It's been a wonderful place to land, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I'm sure there are questions. You're welcome to ask in English or Icelandic.
Well, there's one thing that I would like to ask concerning the tourists.
Mm-hmm.
And what I can't recall quite how you said it, but something about the Westfjords being empty.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a long time to be a tourist in the Westfjords.
It does.
To gather anything in. And that's something that does not fit into marketing.
No, it doesn't. And I think it'll be very interesting. I think it already probably is interesting to see how, especially as I just know a number of my friends back in California, for instance, are so ridiculously eager to travel again. They feel like they've been locked up for such a long time, and they're like, oh, I want to go. This looks like such an amazing place. And yet, I think the reality of most tourism in Iceland between, say, 2008 and 2020 were very short trips. People flying in, doing the stopover thing that Icelandair has, saying, oh, just fly in, spend 2 or 3 days, almost necessarily near Reykjavik, and then going on. So will people actually make the time commitment to come up into the Westfjords? And then how does that affect their experience here? If it rains for 3 days and they only have 4, are they going to be grumpy? Well, we know they'll be grumpy, but and so yeah, I just, as someone who cares a lot about human history in any landscape, but in particular here, a place that I'm trying to make my new home. Every time I've seen those marketing campaigns, it's troubling, both in terms of creating perhaps a false impression, causing people not to see the history when it's there in front of them, but maybe also contributing to unrealistic expectations about what people's experience will be here. Yeah, I agree with you.
Well, what's the project?
Pardon?
What's your deliverable of this project? Like, what will be?
That is something I'm actually still trying to think about, in all honesty. My Fulbright grant has ended, so I'm not doing that anymore. They were wonderful in supporting me to start this project, but historical research tends to take a lot of time. And there was some level of audacity of me being someone who can barely say the most basic words in Icelandic to come and do a historic project here, where I can't interview old time residents if they don't have strong English themselves, and I can't read historic documents with any kind of nuance. I so far have been mostly gathering work done by others. I haven't done a lot of original research myself, other than talking with people and looking at the landscape, taking photographs. I would love for this to become a book of some sort, but I'd rather it not be a sort of a traditional academic book, because that tends to have such a small readership. And I'd really love to, and this is where I still don't know what this would look like. I'd love for this project to be helpful to this region in some way, whether that's just simply to better articulate in English the history of the Westfjords and this particular corner of the Westfjords, or whether that's, again, audacious of someone who's an outsider to come and say, let me write your history for you. So I'm still trying to figure out what the product is. Check back in 6 months.
There's one thing I'm wondering, so what wilderness means? Because most of Iceland is actually a desert.
Yeah.
In very literal terms.
Yeah.
About 70% of the country is completely inhospitable to human life. And that's, even much of that is not untouched by man, because, well, we sent sheep all the way to Northern, and that's why we know we knew where that was.
Right.
But even so, that is a region where you only have people coming for a short term, so it's not where somebody lived.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a fundamental difference between many of the better known attractions or of the better known regions of Iceland, which are actually places that nobody ever lived.
Mm-hmm.
And then regions like the one we're talking about, which is mostly areas that people did live, but have been abandoned. Right. Because even though settlement ends now in Árneshreppur, it used to reach all the way along the coast.
Right, right, and exactly.
That distinction seems pretty relevant to me, but often elided.
Yeah, it's interesting. I come from the US, where I think ideas of wilderness have become especially polarized, perhaps. And one thing I keep wanting one of the students here to study is whether the increase in American tourism, US tourism specifically, in the last decade or so has been slightly shifting attitudes about wilderness in Iceland as a result of people bringing more US-based definitions. Even the concept of wilderness in the US is experiencing a lot of challenges these days because of the increased understanding and recognition of the intensity with which Native peoples often manage the landscape. And so even places that were thought of as untouched or unpeopled are often now thought of as peopled. And sometimes that's only seasonal, but it's still an important, it's not necessarily making the same kind of impacts on landscapes that lived in places are, but I think understanding seasonal use as part of that cultural experience of a place is also important. Again, not to just finish the sentence real quickly, just not to say that it needs to continue. Just because something happened in the past doesn't mean that it needs to happen in the future, but recognizing that it did happen in the past is one of the things that I'm most interested in highlighting, and not simply saying, oh, it was a long time ago, so it doesn't matter.
The extent of the depopulation of the Americas is much greater than people.
Exactly.
Up until very recently, it's what, something like 90%?
Yeah. Huge.
It's absurd.
Yeah. And there was often
when the native people died of disease before the European saw the place, they can assume, oh, this is empty. It wasn't, it hadn't been that happened. So yeah.
Exactly, that assumption of emptiness and the assumption of that the landscape they were seeing was purely natural when it was actually deeply managed. And so it's understanding the ways in which people manage the resources they rely upon, and often are in. I was reading an article recently about eider ducks and how, you know, the deep ways in which eider farmers are in a sort of a symbiotic relationship with these birds, and then are also having negative impacts on things that might want to eat the birds. So, you know, just untangling some of these kinds of relationships and better understanding what the nature that you're seeing, where it has come from and how it's been shaped over time, I think is, I'm hoping that it would give people more than just sort of the beautiful Instagram shot. I mean, I shouldn't have my Northern Lights picture here because it's just perpetuating the stereotype. At least there's little traces of humans in it. You know, there's such a perception of nature as simply capital N nature, without an assumption that if humans are living or working near it, that is a negative impact. And so I think by better advertising is the wrong word, but better understanding and making available information about the human history of this place, I'm hoping that people would start to see it as more of that ongoing conversation between the natural and human, rather than simply one or the other.
You mentioned some traces of humans in that there are theories that we only can see pure nature if we have some comparison and some traces of human. There we have this biggest concrete building in the 30s in Iceland. Indeed, quite an ugly construction in my eyes, but it makes this huge contrast. Do you think that can you measure this in Iceland compared to other places? Let's say Ingólfsfjörður, there you have an even more picturesque fish processing farm. Would it be in Lower Manhattan? Or it would no longer be in Lower Manhattan, untouched of course, but would it be in some place with a lot of other concrete buildings around? Would it work in the same way? Would would it attract the same attention? And is this measurable?
It's funny. I avoid measuring things. For one thing, numbers and I usually don't get along very well. And I'm not sure that measuring it is helpful. I'm not sure what that tells you. I do think that, yeah, often the natural world does seem more, where natural qualities maybe stand out more when they are contrasted with next to something that is a human construct. Although it's also interesting how people respond to industrial ruins differently. There's a wonderful article about the now museum at Djupavik. And the researcher, when she was first arriving, there was a photographer that was complaining to her that the Aussie and his sons had painted the factory, and in his eyes ruined it because it had looked so much more picturesque as a ruin when it was unpainted. But of course, the building will fall apart if it remains unpainted. And I think there's, yeah, I don't know that you can measure those things because it's such a subjective reaction in terms of whether people respond positively or negatively to human relics in the landscape and how old and what kind, and would they rather see wooden structures than concrete? It would be
interesting for advertising.
Yes,
that's, for example,
that's true.
Okay. Marianne.
In connection with this, I can point out to you areas where you have something similar, and that is in the remnants of communistic buildings in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
I can point out in Königsberg, this is called
Kaliningrad.
Kaliningrad. Where you have these huge buildings also, and wastelands around them, used for former, I think, army exercises.
Mm-hmm.
They are a tourist attraction, but they're very easy to access because it's on the beaches, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have Djupavik, you really need to go off the road to get all the way there.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it is worth advertising or marketing, because as soon as you get people into that area, you have it crowded.
Yeah.
And then the vision of this emptiness and so on is gone.
Yeah, it's interesting. The one little bit I did with numbers, which is maybe silly. I'm not sure this is a useful observation or not, but I couldn't sleep earlier this summer and was just playing around with numbers in my head, and I divided the population of Árneshreppur, which was about 40 people, by the total population of Iceland. And I got a proportion of the people in Iceland that live there of 0.013%. It's an extremely small proportion. But then I divided the population of Iceland by the population of Europe. I didn't even use the whole world, I just used Europe. And while the number is not identical, it is the same scale. It's 0.046%, in case you were wondering. And so obviously there's a difference of scale here, and one is a sovereign nation and one is not. But I do think it's interesting that some of the arguments that get made about how remote, how unpopulated this region is, the same argument could be made about Iceland itself. Yes. By the rest of Europe.
You've been talking about the remote region of the Westfjords.
Mm-hmm.
That is a remote region of Iceland, which is a remote country of Europe.
Exactly. Unless you're on a boat, in which case you can go anywhere.
And unless all the others are also on the boat.
Yes.
And, our time is over. Thank you very much, Laura Watt, coming to Vísindaport University in the Westfjords. We hope to see you again next week. Tack fyrir, and you're welcome to talk with Laura in privacy.
Thanks so much.
Bless.
How do I turn off recording?